Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers. Let's sit around the campfire together and talk about Dead by Daylight. Specifically, the new survivor and entity cultist turned entity victim, Taurie Cain. The Doomed Course chapter is here, and as I said in my Houndmaster video, this chapter is one of my all-time favourite originals. The new killer kinda ticks all the boxes for me. She's a historical domain killer with a distinct and stylish design, fun morally grey backstory, and a unique relationship with the entity. And by coincidence, her power is really fun as well. She's just a smash hit of a killer. But as much as I enjoy Houndmaster for what she is, I think the real standout of this chapter, at least by the quality of the lore, is the survivor of this release. I'm just going to come out and say it now. I think Taurie Cain has the best lore of any original survivor, at least without tomed under consideration because of course she doesn't have one yet. For those who don't know, Taurie is a cultist dedicated to the worship of and sacrifice to the entity. The kind of thing I always expected that we'd get someday, but maybe as a killer, not as a survivor. The Black Vale, the cult that worships the entity, has been a long-standing feature of Dead by Daylight's lore since the Descend Beyond chapter, and Taurie does something very special with it, that tells us more about the cult than we've ever seen before, while painting a brutally uncompromising picture of Taurie as a character as well. But what's her lore actually about? Taurie Cain was born in Glasgow in Scotland, and to an outsider looking in, life in the Cain household was a little peculiar but nothing too out of the ordinary. Taurie and her brother Ewan were homeschooled, which is far from common in Scotland but has become increasingly normalised over the past few years, with the number of kids being homeschooled going from fewer than 700 to more than 2,000 in just 7 years. But what really made Taurie and Ewan's upbringing was what they were being taught behind closed doors. Their parents were members of the Disciples of the Black Talon, an organisation dedicated to the worship of some cosmic abomination, an ancient and all-powerful, entity, if you like, that they referred to as the Black Talon. We might have another name for it. Taurie and Ewan's parents believed that this Black Talon was somehow helping humanity transcend their plebeian mortal existences in service of something far greater. And yet despite their devotion, the Cain family seemed relatively normal from the outside. Her parents were academics who took the kids on holidays to desolate ruins and historical excavation sites, the kind of places that Vittorio visited with Talos in his lore. Many of these places, steeped as they were in blood and cruelty, were said to have an overlap between the Black Talon's dimension and our mortal world, and the Disciples studied these overlaps intensely to glean as much as they could about the world that lay beyond. The Cain family visited one such site in Turkey, where a blood ritual had taken place a very long time ago, involving symbols carved on the skulls of dead sacrifices. The well of pooling suffering and pain caused the entity's realm to bleed into our own, and to explore that bleed, the Disciples wore hazmat suits to protect them from whatever lies within. Probably, I guess, well, a hazmat suit's better than nothing, right? Taurie and Ewan stayed behind while the Cain parents entered the bleed, but when they didn't come back, the children followed their parents in. Only one hazmat suit was left, a decrepit old suit that Ewan used, while Taurie braved the horrors of the bleed without any protection at all. It wasn't long before they came across their mother, or what was left of her, shredded to bits inside her ruined hazmat suit, and when they found their father unconscious they tried to haul him back to safety, but something got to them before they could. Weighed down by his antiquated suit, Ewan was attacked and snatched away by mysterious predators from the bleed right in front of Taurie's eyes. But with no time to mourn her mother or brother, Taurie hauled her father back from the gates of hell. Suffice to say, the Disciples were impressed. While her father recovered, Taurie found herself rising through the Disciples' ranks quickly as she redoubled her efforts, invigorated by her trip into another world. Bizarre rituals, clandestine operations, and more trips into the bleeds. The more she did for the Disciples, the higher her value to the cult became, and the stronger and more confident she felt in herself, until her final assignment arrived, the first life that Taurie would take. And here's where a character we've met before joins the fray. Jordan Noir, the brother of our very own Hadi Kor, who was investigating the bleeds between worlds in the aftermath of his sister's disappearance. He believed the Disciples were responsible for Hadi's disappearance in the French Alps, and he was causing quite the commotion about it. So it fell to Taurie to ensure his silence. She tracked him down, caught Jordan at his most vulnerable, and tied him up in an abandoned underground facility. But just as Taurie drew the knife and prepared for the killing strike, she hesitated. Just for a little bit, a momentary pause, as the reality of killing hit her like a truck. But that pause was long enough. A black fog descended on the pair, the knife cold in Taurie's hands as she was whisked away back to the bleed. No, beyond the bleed, to somewhere else entirely. And thus the entity claimed Taurie Cain for its own. Right away, even from that brief summary, it's obvious that Taurie's lore is something very special, and normally when covering a brand new character, I'd start by combing through the character themselves, what kind of person they are and what the lore paints at them, before looking at the wider implications for DBD's lore. But this time I don't think I can do that, because Taurie as a character is defined by her connections to the Disciple of the Black Talon, the entity-worshipping cult into which she and her family were inducted. While it doesn't use the same name that we're used to, it's clear from everything from the black robes to the ritual sacrifice that the Disciples are a splinter group or an isolated sect of, or just another name for, the Black Vale, the entity-worshipping cult that has appeared many times throughout DBD's history. Introduced in the Blight's lore, the Black Vale has cropped up in the stories of the twins, the artist Elodie, Jonah, Dredge, Haddie, Knight, Vittorio and Nicholas Cade, as well as being central to the story of the casting of Frank Stone. Don't worry, I have not forgotten about that game. They keep cropping up like a bad penny at various points throughout history as they seek to appease the entity through constant ritual sacrifice, experimentation, to better understand or harness the entity's power. Taurie's cult, the Disciples of the Black Talon, are the Black Vale in all but name, and it's worth noting that the Black Vale hasn't always used the same name to begin with. In Chile, during the Pinochet regime, the mysterious and all-powerful acolytes of the entity used the name the VAC label. Fucking VAC label. Not subtle at all, are your behaviour? Meanwhile, in the Observer's story starring the Japanese warrior Saku, she finds herself facing off against the Black Serpent Society, which are a bunch of hooded mystics worshipping the entity. It's possible that Taurie's Disciples of the Black Talon are a version of the Black Veil from another universe, but I think the explanation behind the name change is a lot simpler. The Black Veil is an ancient global organisation, and for most of its existence, its members would have been unable to communicate over long distances. So it makes sense that over time these denominations would become more distinct to the point of becoming independent and functioning separately, under different names, the only thing they have in common being their goal of appeasing the entity. Taurie's story. Oh, that's fun to say. Taurie's story. Well, Taurie's story looks at a particular Black Veil sect or rip-off or whatever in a totally different way than any of DBD's stories have ever done before. Because while the Black Veil isn't present in the lore for years, we've never really gotten a good sense of what they're like on a day-to-day basis. Until Taurie's release, we never knew how they recruited, or even exactly what they taught to their members beyond, oh wow, isn't the entity just so cool, guys? But Taurie's lore gives us a whole different perspective. She's born into the Disciples and spends her entire life completely poisoned by the cult's narrative and control. By seeing how it controls her, we can see the Black Veil's recruitment methodology and goals writ large, and only by understanding that can we see what makes Taurie Cain who she is, and what makes her so special. So the Disciples of the Black Talon got their claws in Taurie young, their talons if you will, by recruiting her parents so that her and her brother Ewan grew up with the cult's beliefs and practices already taken for granted as a factor of their lives. The siblings were homeschooled, which as the story points out is very unusual in Scotland and makes complete sense for a cult attempting to indoctrinate children into their ideology. Why would you risk a kid spending 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, outside the house with other people and other kids, who could teach them something that your cult might find problematic? It helps that both their parents are academics who are implied to be reasonably well off financially. It's the perfect means to create a new generation of recruits who are educated enough to be useful assets to the cult without being curious or worldly enough to question its doctrines. Taurie's parents being devout members of the cult meant that Taurie and Ewan effectively had no opportunity to ever leave it, because not only would they be abandoning the ways of life they had always known literally since their birth, they'd also be rejected by their parents at best and actively hunted down at worst. By the time they had the independence to make decisions like these for themselves, they were already roped completely into the cult. All of these practices align with what we would expect from cult tactics in real life, especially religious cults like the Manson family who were taught that they were reincarnations of the original Christians who followed Christ during his lifetime. Manson recruited mostly from the middle class, often students or academics who were curious for answers that Manson was only too happy to provide. And Taurie's parents fit that mould too. Vincent and Rachel Cain taught archaeology and anthropology respectively, both fields that would naturally lead them to ask questions about ancient history, practices and forms of worship. As representatives of the entity on Earth, the Disciples would be very interested in satiating their curiosity with their doctrine and practices, so it's only natural that the cult got Vincent, Rachel, and eventually their children under their sway. Cult practices being presented somewhat realistically in Taurie's lore is pretty unprecedented, because DBD's take on cults has typically shied away from grounded portrayals of cults in favour of a more fantastical portrayal that you might normally expect to see in a cosmic horror story. This might sound a bit odd, but let me explain. In fiction, you'll commonly see two kinds of cults. I call them the Scientology style and the Lovecraft style. Scientology style cults are explicitly selfish organisations that work a lot like real cults do, and are often pastiches of existing well-known cults, like, well, Scientology.
Beth Gaga Shaggy, no relation to either Lady Gaga or Shaggy, is the founder of Spaceology, a religion, not a cult.
Think of something like the Church of the Collective from The Boys. These cults aren't always religious, and when they are, it's typically understood that their religiousness is a recruitment method. It's marketing, not genuine religious devotion. These tend to hew more closely to the practices of real cults like the Manson family and the Church of Scientology. But in horror or fantasy media, the term cult is loaded and used completely differently. Thanks in large part to the works of H.P. Lovecraft, like Call of Cthulhu, cults in horror media often take on a more fantastical undertone than real-life cults or their portrayals in more realistic fiction. These cults are treated more like an earnest religion, with specific ritual practices and a general acceptance that whatever they're worshipping is real. Think the Solari from 2013's Tomb Raider. If you're seeing a cult in black hoods chanting and preparing human sacrifice in a horror movie or game, odds are whatever they're worshipping is probably real, and the story rarely pretends otherwise. For years, the Black Veil has adhered closer to that characterization, that of a cabal of worshippers whose secrecy allows stories about them to be kept intentionally vague with regards to their practices and their beliefs. Taurie Story takes that intentional vagueness and puts it through a paper shredder. The Black Veil goes from being painted in broad strokes to suddenly being put in focus in great detail. We know how they recruit. They target intellectuals and families to capitalise on curiosity and find a captive audience. We know what they want. They believe the entity holds the secrets of arcane technologies from other worlds within the realm, and they seek that power for themselves, much like Vittorio did. And as we follow Taurie's story, the Black Veil almost becomes humanised a little bit. Behind that veil of power and intrigue, it's clear that this is a group of people with large but limited resources and legitimate problems they have to solve to achieve their goal. A great example of this is the situation in Turkey with the hazmat suits. They only have a couple of suits to explore the bleed. One of the suits is old and antiquated and nobody even really knows if they do anything. It's just the best they've got. And they make it work because they don't have an alternative. It's not the kind of problem you'd expect an evil cabal of cultists to run into, but they're operating in rural Turkey out of an ad hoc secret base. They can't exactly go to Costco and put in a bulk order for PPE designed explicitly for their trip to hell. They've got to conduct things in secret and make what they have go far. That's a very human problem to have, that makes the Black Veil seem more like an organisation as opposed to just a nebulous threat. Another threat to that organisation is one that made me do the Leonardo DiCaprio pointing gif. Hattie's brother Jordan, who's taken up a one-man crusade against the Black Veil and seems to be making genuine headway. He recorded a Black Veil sacrificial ceremony at a scientific facility, which the group were able to luckily smear as a hoax, but his continued meddling was not a risk the disciples were able to accept for long. Side note, by the way, that hoax of a sacrificial ceremony at a scientific facility did actually happen in real life. Some pranksters filmed that exact same thing at the CERN research facility in Switzerland in 2016, and it was naturally a hoax. Taurie's lore offers an alternative explanation. Jordan recorded it, that it was a real Black Veil ceremony smeared as a hoax to cover their tracks, which is a really nice touch in this story that grounds it in reality and gives us an approximate date for Jordan's abduction, the latter half of 2016. Unlike a normal story where the Black Veil is causing problems, this time we get to see how the Black Veil handles its problems, and its solution is Taurie Cain. She's sent on her mission and drags Jordan in front of her masters to complete the sacrifice and become a full inductee. And despite all the expectations piled onto her and the cult elders surrounding her, Taurie hesitates. It's only for a moment, but it's that moment that saves Jordan's life. If she'd have moved any quicker, or with any more certainty, she'd have killed him before the entity took them both, and she'd have entered the fog with Jordan's blood on her hands. This situation is one of the few occasions in this story where Taurie is given just a little dribble of agency, that after a lifetime of control by the disciples, she finally has a choice. And I love how realistically conflicted she is about what she should do next. Killing someone is a big step forward, even for a devoted inductee, but it isn't like seeing Jordan at her mercy stops her completely. She's still a tool for the disciples, but at least for a second, we see the real Taurie Cain flicker to the surface. Someone who, despite everything, doesn't want to see people hurt unnecessarily in the pursuit of enlightenment. She's not killing out of bloodlust. She's doing what needs to be done. And we see this conviction to do the right thing earlier in her story as well, when she ventures into the bleed to save her parents. Ewan's initially too scared to go in, but not only would Taurie risk everything to save her parents, but she'll do so without even bringing any protective equipment, simply because somebody has to do something, and if Ewan isn't going to help her, she'll just go on her own. Even without the security and protection that the disciples offer, Taurie will put herself in harm's way to help, and whether it's in aid of her family or an eldritch murder cult, that selfless driving capacity for sacrifice is ultimately noble. Despite her life being anything but normal, we see a lot of normal drives and emotions reflected in Taurie's actions that we can recognise in a perfectly normal, decent person. She earnestly cares for her family, she fears for her life even as she wanders around in the bleed to find them, and how she reacts to continued attention and promotions from her masters and the disciples tells us a lot about how and why she does what she does for the cult. At the end of the day, Taurie Cain wants what we all want out of life. A reason to keep going. A purpose to get up in the morning and put one foot in front of the other. And by forcing itself into her life from the moment she was born, the Black Veil is providing her that meaning. That knowledge that she is fulfilling whatever she sees as her purpose fills her with strength and confidence. It serves her as a way to show that despite her skew morality and indoctrinated upbringing, Taurie is a human being just like the rest of us, and is as much a victim of the cult as the man she has tied to her chair in the basement. So with this picture of Taurie, I find the question of her morality to be an interesting one to grok, because while many folks got on record calling her DBD's first evil survivor, I think that's entirely fair. And that's not just because the title goes unquestionably to Jonah, who not only did kill people, but did so after joining a clandestine organisation of murder and misinformation of his own free will. Through her actions and thoughts in this story, it's clear to me that Taurie thinks and feels and wants just like a normal person. But everything about her is filtered by the purpose the Black Veil instilled in her, by the values she was brought up with by her parents, and by the isolation from the society she was always taught to view as the enemy. Obviously she does bad things, and the story never tries to justify the harm that she causes, but it is not in her nature to be harmful. From her perspective, she's simply doing what needs to be done for the betterment of humanity, and that perspective has been carefully groomed and maintained by the disciples to prevent her seeing life any other way. Only when viewing the story as a whole do we see Taurie in her entirety. We can appreciate the person she is, and what the Black Veil turned her into. It's a level of depth that most survivors don't tend to get until their tomes, that can sometimes drop years after their release. Even before her tome lands eventually, Taurie feels like a complete character. She expands the Black Veil by painting their actions and practices in a lot more depth and intrigue than we've ever had before, and shows how they might manipulate a selfless, driven and well-meaning young woman to unspeakable acts in their service. After Sable, Gabriel, and to a lesser extent Vittorio, who are all too often one-note characters to the point of being jokes, Taurie has a lot going on from a character point of view, while also adding depth to one of the most important parts of DBD's lore, the Black Veil. This is why I believe Taurie is DBD's best written survivor. She's written with an enormous amount of intentionality behind everything in that story. You couldn't pick apart her personal story and the Black Veil story that's going on at the same time, because each one is enhanced by how the writer has intertwined them, and it makes for immensely satisfying reading. And it helps that even outside of the written lore, her character is communicated well in her model, perk designs, and even her cosmetics. Her perk designs focus on the theme of self-sacrifice and doing what needs to be done, even as you have to power through the pain. Her voice lines affirm just how lost she is without the guidance of the disciples, but nevertheless show her willingness to knuckle down and fight. Hell, with her ugly sweater, we even have the closest thing we'll ever have to Black Veil branded merch. It is amazing. Even her default lobby animation suggests there's some truth to my theory that the Plague's followers became the first Black Veil cultists, because their poses and actions are very similar. There was never a guarantee that we would ever get a survivor like Taurie Cain, and that's what makes her so special. If we were getting a Black Veil character playable in the game, I was certain it would be a killer. but picking a survival-required behaviour to stick the landing, and present cult practices and methodologies intelligently. That's a tall order for the company behind the VAC label and the Saw tome, but I am thoroughly impressed they managed to stick the landing and provide a genuinely refreshing portrayal of the Black Veil that stands out from the traditional takes horror media has on cults. Taurie is a super unique character both in DBD's world and beyond it, having more in common with Nux from Mad Max Fury Road than any horror character I can think of. I always love to see the Black Veil step out into DBD stories, and Taurie might be their best showing to date. Bravo behaviour. Well, the Black Veil's best showing in Dead by Daylight anyway. Oh yeah baby, whether it's the next video or the one after, we're going back to Cedar Hills very, very soon. Because I'm not done talking about the casting of Frank Stone. Well, that's all I have to say about Taurie Cain, at least until she gets a tome or something interesting happens. I'll be talking more about the content in Doomed Course very, very soon, but I've also got a video on Frank Stone and a bunch of other fun stuff planned. If you're a newcomer here, then please do subscribe, it would mean the world. And special thanks to all my wonderful patrons who make these kind of videos possible and get access to everything I make a day early, unless a sponsor says no or something. You get a name in the credits and some other cool perks too, so do go take a look if you want to slide some cash my way. And thanks also to Spooky Loots for having me on in his recent video about the downfall of the Skull Merchant. Spooky was a very gracious host and it was awesome to be on with him, so yeah, cheers mate. And for everybody here, old or new, well, I'll see you next time. Ta-ta for now.